Okay, so we added the third ingredient. How does it taste, the cake, with the third ingredient? Hopefully the strudel tastes better with sugar than without it. But let me show you a few examples that Mark Ramirez, who's been working on, has produced and working really hard lately. So this is a 4-story reinforced concrete building that was previously analyzed by Kurt Hazelton. And here you see at a relatively small level of shaking, most of your losses when we were doing the 2 ingredients, of course, comes from those 2 ingredients, but they're basically dominated by losses that will take place, and you simply repair it with very little losses coming from the possibility of collapse. But as soon as you add this third ingredient, what you find out is that a big chunk of your losses, not only your losses will go up, but they start to be dominated by this third ingredient that we were previously ignoring. If you start now cranking up to higher levels of ground motion intensity, the effect of this third ingredient increases even further, as you see here. And the reason is, if you now start comparing, especially in ductile structures, what is the possibility that I will have, let's say, a 2% residual interstory drift in my structure compared to the possibility of collapsing? Well, we know that quote-conforming structures have very well good detailing, and they're very likely to survive the earthquake. But anybody who has done shake table studies like Helmut or Masayoshi, or has done a lot of analysis like we now do at Stanford, knows that, it doesn't take a lot of intensity before you start getting this residual interstory drift. So at smaller levels of earthquake intensity, you have substantial probabilities of experiencing large residual interstory drift. And then if you keep on increasing your intensity, you will get to a point, as you see here, where you have equal probability of collapsing and experiencing a large interstory drift that will take you to having to demolish the structure. And then at very high intensity, it's basically dominated by your probability of collapse. And so now when you start comparing older and modern structures, and this is with the help of Abby, who's been doing great simulation recently, instead of older and modern, I like to think in terms of non-ductile and ductile, because you do find those buildings, as I showed you, built in the 50s even, with excellent detailing. And what you see there is that the old ones, actually the 2-ingredient approach is not too bad, because they're still going to be dominated by the probability of collapse. But I think the big problem is on our new ductile structures. With all the analysis we've been doing recently, I think if you don't take into account this third ingredient, your cake is not going to taste very good. If you go to taller structures, it will basically start concentrating lateral deformations in certain stories. And when you start looking into design, you can start going into ridiculous paths in which it actually is good to concentrate lateral deformations, because of course those stories that don't see the deformation don't get damaged. But of course it's the wrong path, because in those stories in which you're concentrating lateral deformation, you're also increasing your probability of residual interstory drift. So I think this is something that we need to put a lot of attention in our new structure that we're designing today. I hope I'm wrong, but I think we're going to see in the next big earthquake in the US a lot of problems with this. Again, that's the color of Helmut's car. And so I think that the big challenge now is to try to go back to the structures and try to ask yourself, well, what is the level of drift at which most of you in the audience, very experienced structural engineers, you would basically call it off and just basically call it a demolition cruise. So we need to figure out, basically what's that level of drift at which these guys will have to be demolished. It's of course building to building dependent, but we need to start studying that to understand this. Of course, if I were to ask Professor Krawinkler what his opinion of my curve is, he would probably say, no good, I don't agree. So what we did is sort of trying to anticipate his reaction. Again, I've never been his student, but I've sort of learned how it works. is to do a sensitivity study and, okay, you don't like my curve, there's a whole family of curves. You pick yours, but I can show you that what we were doing before doesn't work. For example, this is just setting up that level of, this would be the median drift at which you would, in that probability distribution, you would force you to demolish your building. Set it up to 10%, some ridiculous high number. That's essentially what we were doing before, neglecting the 30 reading. And you start looking into, taking into account the possibility of demolishing your building. And in this case, your expected losses at a 10 and 50 level event start going up. Probably some of these curves are pretty unrealistic, but hopefully a lot of you will agree that it's somewhere around that 1.5, like the one I showed you. And clearly the losses in this case, in this particular example for the 4-story building that curve analyzed, they're about 50% higher than what we were computing previously. If you go to expected animal losses, they're of course dominated by smaller intensity events, but still this 30 reading shows up. And I come back to up here, how great it's been to ride along his side, and it's been a real teamwork of a lot of people at Pier. But at least on the Stanford side, it's very clear that he's been the leader and has kept us on the right track, and that's of course Helmut. And I would go as far as saying that, you know, in a few years, it'll be very difficult to talk about performance-based earthquake engineering without mentioning Krawinkler's name. It'll be a little bit like talking about soccer without Pelé, or perhaps Baroque music without a Bach. That's how high he has reached. So with that, of course, I won't even attempt to read that, but a friend of mine was kind enough to write that for me. And what it says is, thank you for teaching us how to do auto mechanics. And it's been great. And I look forward to many years of riding this car with you. And that other one, it's thank you for your leadership and friendship. Finally, just a few words about some of the changes in Helmut's life recently. We all know about his quote-unquote retirement. And there's been several changes, not a lot. You really have to think hard to look for changes. This is one. You've got a sort of more better parking permit in Stanford as a result. He changed buildings. He's got a new building, new office, new sign in his office, and then some bigger changes. And we've heard about this one. And as far as I see it, probably many of you, at least on the Stanford side, would agree, and perhaps even Michelle would agree with us, is that the only real retirement is this one. And I got a small present of the Bellissima Macchina Italiana, and it reads in the bottom, officially retired in December 2007.